Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to address more like a critical analysis or a summary of President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni's SONA 2026 address in terms of a legislative analysis. We have to understand that President Museveni unveiled over 38 bills in his State of the Nation address yesterday. And I would like to break down what this perhaps would mean for the country, but particularly to the ordinary person. It is important. Why? Because, for starters, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni's 38 bill legislative program, especially for the financial year 2026 2027, partially addresses economic needs, but largely prioritizes government control over citizen welfare. The agenda basically revealed that the government is more focused on regulation, revenue extraction, and political control rather than solving Uganda's crisis in terms of climate, land, and even corruption. I will make substantiation in terms of what I just argued. Now, obviously, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni proposed more than 38 bills in terms of things to do with finance, things to do with health, things to do with housing, agriculture, and energy sectors, and then tax measures that include an environmental levy on second-hand clothes and excise duty adjustment that will actually affect the ordinary people, and then health reform that create the National Drug Authority, the Health Professional Regulatory Council to oversee medicines and practitioners, and then housing bills that cover building control and housing welfare and finance and evaluation in terms of regulations. And then the more controversial issue in terms of the protection of the sovereignty bill that criminalizes foreign funding and also imposes a 20-year prison in terms of this sentence. And then when you look at that in light of the Vision 2020, targeting GDP of about what that has to be raised to about 9,500 US dollars per capita. Those are issues that they addressed in the context of it. What is good? What is good is that the legislative program does three things. First, it focuses on economic transformation through wealth-generating sectors like agriculture, energy, and even housing. And secondly, it also establishes a health regulation to improve medicine quality and professional standards. And then thirdly, the housing sector regulation that addresses urbanization in terms of the challenges that Uganda face. These elements partially align with the vision of 2040's economic goal. And we will give that to the good president. What is missing, and this is the aspect of the critical gaps that I think were also important in a way. The five urgent crises in terms of they have a zero legislation in terms of this particular agenda. Look at the education reform, for example. It's completely absent, despite the overcrowded classrooms and the 40% graduate unemployment. There are no educational bills at all. Look at issues to do with climate adaptation. There is no legislative agenda in terms of, despite the agriculture sector, which actually employs about 70% of Ugandans, in terms of financial extension climate threats, even from unpredictable rainfalls and even extreme weather. That is also something that is missing. Look at the land reform. It's also missing, despite rampant land grabbing and even minor tenure conflicts and eviction crises within the urban areas. And then when you also look at the question of the corruption, the anti-corruption has actually no substantive legislation, despite persistent scandals in terms of electricity corporation, health ministry, procurement, even parish development model funds. When you also look at the youth unemployment, youth employment lacks comprehensive legislation. The PDM and the Miogalon, they exist, but they operate without accountability mechanisms or even job creation targets. And then we could also look at it in the context that the government is also regulating construction while ignoring education and climate and even corruption, which I think are the fundamental biting things in in the issues of Uganda today. Now, the another important aspect is the damning revelation that has to do with the sovereignty bill, the aspect of the protection of the sovereignty bill that was ascended in May 2026. The most telling part of this agenda is that it criminalizes the foreign funding for civil society, media, and even advocacy groups, and it imposes the 20-year prison sentences in terms of the violation. The backlash has actually been immediate. Several civil society organizations warned that it will shrink the civic space. Religious leaders across denominations have also condemned it. The World Bank also expresses serious condemnation in terms of that. Bank of Uganda also raised concerns about the economic implications of such a bill. So here is the contradiction in light of the esteemed president. He claimed that this was not the bill he originally proposed to the cabinet, and this suggests either massive communication breakdown or deliberate misdirection. And that is something that you may want to think over. So what this fundamentally reveals in clarity is that government is prioritizing the silencing of critics over hearing its citizens. And that is, is a very serious question for debate. But you should also look at it. How do these bills, for example, reflect in terms of the ordinary Ugandan, and whether or not they are helpful? I would argue no. Why? Because citizens need affordable housing, and the government, offered a low cost housing promise. But critics have actually already dismissed that it is too late given the magnitude of the crisis. And the critics argue that the citizens need a health care access and affordability, and the health regulation addresses quality but does not address access and the aspect of cost. And then the citizens would also need jobs at the end of the day. The PDM and the Myoga loans do exist, but they lack comprehensive legislation and even accountability. And these are very, very serious issues for the ordinary Ugandan. The citizens also need freedom of expression, and the sovereignty bill criminalizes it by targeting foreign-funded civic society in this aspect. And therefore, that is something, again, that we may critique. And then citizens also need education, and there are no educational bills at all. And you and I know that education really is the fountain of a nation. And then the tax measures, they hit the poor hardest. The environmental levy on second-hand clothes make affordable clothing more expensive for millions of Ugandans who cannot afford new garments. You know what we're talking about. The ordinary Ugandan depends heavily on second-hand clothes, And then how about the question of alignment? Can we say that his speech could be aligned in the 2040 vision? Obviously, the agenda is partially aligned economically, but fundamentally misaligned in aspect of sociability. Socially, it's misaligned. On the positive side, there is economic transformation in terms of the focus on wealth generating sectors, agriculture development in terms of prioritization for small, holder farmers, and agro-processing and energy efficient measures that support green economy aspirations. But on the negative side, the sovereignty bill undermines international partnership that Vision 2040 depends on for the development, and there is no climate adaptation legislation despite Vision 2040's green economy aspiration. And human capital through education and healthcare remains unfunded despite being foundation in terms of the 2040 vision. Tax measures are hurting the poor instead of creating inclusive growth. That is a serious issue. Now, the reality is even stark that after 13 years, Uganda has achieved about 0.5% of GDP target and 10% of its per capita income target. That is serious food for thought. So, by way of an assessment, a final assessment, one would argue and say that the government's priorities are actually clear from this legislative agenda. First, control over citizens through the sovereignty bill that criminalizes foreign funding and restricts civil society. But then second, in terms of the revenue extraction through taxes that hit, unfortunately, the ordinary poor person, like things like the environmental levy on second-hand clothes. And then third, the regulatory expansion through the 38 bills, creating a bureaucratic layer, without guaranteeing service delivery. And then perhaps fourth, the vision, becomes a theater. Why? Because it doesn't have implementation, as Vision 2040 remains fundamentally unimplemented even after 13 years. So what Uganda therefore needs, instead of education reform, climate adaptation, land reform, anti-corruption, strengthening, and even comprehensive youth unemployment, that becomes a fundamental as a substantive legislation requirement. The verdict therefore becomes clear that this legislative agenda serves the government, unfortunately, and not the people. And therefore, we lose the debate in light of Solus Lex Suprema. The welfare of the people becomes supreme. Uganda deserves laws that solve their crises, not laws that simply regulate them. Parliament must demand a citizen-driven legislative program. So the question is, will they? That, my friend, is food for thought. Thank you very much, and God bless you.